y'all. Welcome to the Piouspodium. It's your host, Nemi Jimenez. Here at the Piouspodium, we talk everything about apologetics, philosophy, and difficult questions in theology. Today, we're going to have a really cool discussion, a little bit of a talk about epistemology and different perspectives in epistemology. Epistemology is a subdiscipline of philosophy that asks a lot of different questions about the nature of knowledge, how we get knowledge, how we can be certain about the knowledge that we get. And as we usually do here, we're going to go about some of the secular, non-Christian approaches that I think fail in some ways and can only be correctly constructed. The only lens that we can really get to justify and have good truth and knowledge is if we do so in a Christian perspective based on God's nature himself. So let's talk a little bit first about the connections and the perspectives, right, of epistemology that come from the other disciplines of philosophy or subdisciplines of philosophy that are metaphysics and ethics. So in metaphysics, we talk a little bit about how there's a distinction between God and his creatures, which are us, the created. And in that, we think a little bit about his transcendence and his eminence, which is trying to talk a little bit about or references a little bit about how God is close to us. God is relational. He has a relationship with human beings. He has a relationship with his creation. When the angel came to Mary, said his name will be Emmanuel, God with us. He's near, he is close, but he's also transcendent, which is trying to distinguish that although God is close to us, he's also Lord and above us. And in the same way that we have this metaphysical distinction between God and his creatures, we also have this same distinction in epistemology. And so metaphysics has some perspective on epistemology itself. How does that happen? Epistemology, when we think about God's distinction of being transcendent and eminent, being close and being high above and Lord above all, we see that in epistemology, we do not get any knowledge outside of the lordship of God himself. God is above. God has all the knowledge about the world metaphysically. He has all of the knowledge and the truth about ethics, what is right and what is wrong. He has all the knowledge about what is just, what is a courageous thing. He has everything about beauty. He has all that knowledge in himself. And that knowledge is separate from us. We do not have it in and of ourselves. We are entirely dependent of God for that knowledge. God is the primary knower of all things. And we, in our pursuit of truth, access God's primary knowledge. So what are the differences between God's knowledge and our knowledge? What's the metaphysical distinction here? Well, first is that his knowledge is self-sufficient and ours is dependent. God knows all things. He doesn't need any verification from anyone else. He created all things. He knows, he is all good, meaning he knows everything about good and evil without any kind of experimentation, without looking to go ask for another source of reliability. He himself is the ultimate reliability source. And the second part is that his knowledge is complete while ours is limited in perspective. God knows all things comprehensively. He knows why everything is right and wrong. He knows why everything is the way it is in its fullness. There's not one little piece of information or knowledge about anything that God is lacking in. We are the ones who are lacking inside of our knowledge. Our knowledge is partial and it's dependent of God. So that's the connection to metaphysics. When we talk about epistemology, though, we actually see some other things that is implied or has a perspective in ethics. So epistemology, like I said, is our knowledge and our justification of knowledge and truth. And the way that we pursue our truth has ethical questions. When we're talking about epistemology, we still ask questions like what we should believe, right? And that's an ethical question about what we should or shouldn't. It's about virtue. So in epistemology, we ask what we should believe, and most people come to the conclusion, that what we should believe is what is true, right? We shouldn't believe things that are false. Another little ethical, let's say, principle that we apply into epistemology is that we shouldn't suppress evidence, right? Because that would be showing a intellectual dishonesty, right? And I love it because even in secular philosophy, in William Clifford, he's a secular philosopher, but he talks about this in his book, The Ethics of Belief. And I love it because in my undergrad, this is one of the first things that I learned in my logic class, that there are ethical principles that we have to hold on to if we're going to actually pursue truth. in an honorable way. Some of these include things like, he calls it intellectual integrity and intellectual humility. These are just two examples. And intellectual integrity is when we hold other people who hold different opinions to us, and we hold them to the same standards that we would hold ourselves to. And that integrity goes vice versa. We have to hold ourselves to the same high level of, let's say, evidence, of argumentation that we demand from another position that's not our own. And so it's also admitting our inconsistencies in our thoughts when we don't live up to the rigorous demand of evidence or of justification that we have. In the same way, he also talks about intellectual humility, which is having a consciousness and understanding and admittance and acknowledgement of the limit of our own knowledge. And it's crazy because this guy is a secular philosopher, but he's actually pinpointing some of the basic principles of a Christian epistemology. We have to know that we are limited in our knowledge and that the only one who has complete knowledge is God. Now, Clifford might obviously negate or deny such a thing. However, we could see the common grace in intellectual integrity and intellectual humility. And in intellectual humility, he also talks about how we have to acknowledge our egocentrism in our thinking, right? Where we want to be right. We want the way that we have reasoned something to be the way that somebody accepts it. And these perspectives, right, of metaphysics and ethics and epistemology work the other way, right? When we think about metaphysical truth or we think about ethical truth, we have to ask ourselves, how did we get this knowledge? Are we justified in believing the moral truths that we hold on to or the truths that we have about the world around us and reality? So it works both ways. And we could go on and on about how they go about each other. This is just to show us, right, the perspectives in epistemology in an introductory way. And what's most important, right, then, is that when we study philosophy, we don't ever isolate any of the subdisciplines from one another because they serve as perspectives that presuppose and imply things in the other. So there are other perspectives now that are within epistemology that I really want to touch on. And I'm going to be basing a lot of this work on John Frame. He builds a lot of his epistemology in his book, The Doctrine of the Knowledge of God. And we've spoken about him in concerns to the perspective and the triad in ethics of the normative, situational, and existential perspectives. And interestingly enough, he uses the same triad inside of epistemology. He uses it in a lot of particular ways, and we're going to do that. We're going to look at some of the secular ways, non-Christian ways of epistemology, and we're going to see how, again, they exalt one perspective above the other. They negate the reality of the other two and their importance. Because once again, there's a unity and diversity that needs to be explained, that connection. So before we get into that, I want to talk about what are the questions in epistemology, both secular and the Christian reconstruction, that we're going to be talking about. We have, what is the basis of knowledge? What are the objects of knowledge? 2, how do we get knowledge? Are there different kinds of knowledge? And how do we justify our knowledge? And in the justification of knowledge, there are 2 parts. There's the location of justification and the structure of our justification. So let's get into this. What are the 2 main secular philosophies when it comes to epistemology? The 2 of them when it comes to knowledge are what we call objectivism and subjectivism. So again, I always say this before I talk about any particular subject in philosophy. The definition of these terms changes throughout history. Each proponent of the perspective and of the concept might define it differently, might have different even arguments for and against them. This is something that is overview. It's something that I think is more used in common day language. And this doesn't mean that the Christian objections to these perspectives aren't valid throughout history. They are. But I just always want to remind people, right? Because we can't suppose when we're arguing with somebody else who holds on to these concepts. We can't just presuppose we know what they mean by it. We have to definitely be super exact, I think, in our way of defining these things in argumentation. But for overview purposes, let's talk about this. Objectivism is the way that we get knowledge objectively through either 1, reason, or 2, empirical data. And when we say that one of these ways of getting knowledge or one of these knowledges are more true than the other, we create a hierarchy. We say that maybe one happens before the other and gives way to the other. We call these perspectives decently rationalism or empiricism. These are the two different positions in epistemology. And some people through philosophy say that we can only think of that which we have seen, right? So in that sense, they're taking empiricism and they're saying that we can only have reasoning, rational thought based on the empirical data that we have received. There is no way of purely reasoning. All our reason, I don't want to say contaminated, but has been in some ways influenced by the empirical things that we have sensed, right? And there are other people who go the complete opposite way, which try and talk about how logical and mathematical truths are logical truths, rational truths, pure truths that aren't defiled in any way by our empirical data, our empirical senses. Some rationalists, more famously throughout history, the most famous, I believe, would be Descartes, was one who went so far in their enamorment, their love for rationalism and reason, and the denial of empiricism, that they went as far as saying that they weren't even sure that the external world even existed because of how much they doubted their senses and their ability to get accurate data from the empirical world. And at their core, what we're trying to do here is look at how they are supposing or elevating a particular perspective that comes from the Christian approach. At the core of rationalism, we have a focus on the norms for knowledge. The abstract impersonal truths, however, they must have input from the real world. They must have a connection to the real world, or else they aren't really valid truths whatsoever. So let me put an example for us. How do we, let's say we say that one truth is that murder is wrong. Murder is not just a concept that we, in our minds, just lofty, all above in the heavens, we just get this idea of murder and we just know it's wrong. For us to really even identify murder, right, we'd have to see it in the real world. So we have to have a situational perspective where this concept comes into fruition. Murder is not just the concept, it's an act that happens in our physical world with real people. And on the other end, empiricism needs the abstract norms and conceptions, and it can't really just elevate the situational, right? Let me put an example to this here. We can know that stealing is wrong, for example, right? Because we see it in the world. That's the situational, right? That act of stealing involves different rational ideas like concepts of property, concepts of mens rea, which is the intent to steal something. These are concepts that are found only through reason. They're not really empirical things that come to us through our senses. And so in rationalism or in objectivism, in this part of rationalism and empiricism, we have the elevation of both the normative and situational perspectives. And that would leave this last one, objectivism, and I said the last one was subjectivism. And in subjectivism, we have something a little bit different. It's a denial or sometimes it can be even seen as a skepticism of the rational and empirical approaches. And subjectivism then is just knowledge is what the person believes. This is like the overemphasis of the existential, because they are right in this sense. We are the people who observe. We are the ones who reason. We are the ones who get knowledge. However, knowledge in and of itself isn't just whatever the person believes. They are grounded in particular ways of getting knowledge and justification for us to consider them good knowledge. Like I said, remember that ethical thing, what we should believe. So the Christian approach, right, sees that all these perspectives are revealing God's nature. They are part of a puzzle. There's a unity and diversity, right? The rational approach depends on the empirical data, but the empirical data also involves the rational. However, that objective enterprise still depends on the subjective in the sense that we are the ones observing, right? And we are the ones who are doing the pursuing of knowledge and accepting the knowledge. At the same time, that subjective enterprise is not entirely independent of that objectivist perspective of We need reasoning, though. We need empirical data, however, to even believe anything, right? There must be those objects of knowledge. So like I said, that unity and diversity is connected, and it's explained by God's nature, his Trinitarian nature. So let's try and put this more in a definitive statement. For the Christian, the norm is that God gives knowledge. God is the one who gives all knowledge. Like we said at the beginning, God is the primary knower. And so all knowledge is dependent on him giving it to us. That's the norm. The situational is the world that we know him and we know the world through. And this is really key. The last is then the existential perspective, where we understand that we are the people who are pursuing knowledge and we are the ones who are accepting the knowledge. And that kind of makes up the Christian construction. And we just saw before in objectivism and subjectivism, we saw how they delineate a little bit from these Christian approaches. However, they deny that God is the source of these things. And in doing so, we'll see in a lot of other conversations that we have, we actually lose the reliability of knowledge, even from empiricism or from rationalism, without God being in the middle of it all. So that's basic in epistemology. Let's go a little bit deeper here into the theories of truth. There are three main theories of truth in the subdiscipline of epistemology that I want to touch upon. There are so many things to talk about in epistemology. This is kind of probably be just the first little podcast episode where we talk about it, because there's so much more. But I want to kind of hone in here about these three perspectives in what truth is and how we get truth. Or it's more really about what truth is. Here we have this, okay? Correspondence theory of truth, we have the pragmatic theory of truth, and the coherence theory of truth. So what's the correspondence theory of truth? The correspondence theory of truth is that a statement is true so long as it corresponds to the way things really are. So one, we're assuming, right, the metaphysical existence of an external world. And we are also presupposing, right, that our mind can reason and our senses can even perceive this real world accurately. Those are some really good assumptions that we have to have here in the correspondence theory of truth. I want to make them known to us. Those are assumptions. We take those for granted. We accept them as true when we accept the correspondence theory of truth. And this theory of truth is the one that is popular. It's the one that we use in everyday scientific investigation. Because in science, right, we test statements, we test hypotheses and theories to see if they correspond with reality. Like I said, that there's some assumptions in the middle of it that I think we need to point out, that without God, we actually lack a reliability in this perspective. So first off, this perspective doesn't add God into the mix. Things aren't just true because reality is that way. Reality and the way things are dependent on God for being that way, metaphysically speaking. And when we're talking about justifying a statement with the way things are, we have a huge problem in that we are assuming that we can get this transcendent view of the statement and the way things are as if we were God himself. Only God has that view of the way things truly are. We don't have that. And so the question is, how can we correspond between our statement or our hypothesis about the way things are in the world and what reality really is? How can we say that we have that perspective? Not just metaphysically or scientifically speaking, even morally speaking, right? If we're trying to find moral truths, how can we justify and say that we have the perspective to see our statement and to see the way things are, the way the things are in the real world, and seeing how they connect together? Like that's a connection that we have to have a particular perspective on that humans don't really have. So that's the problem with the correspondence theory of truth when it's done secularly. The next perspective is the pragmatic theory of truth, which is basically saying that what is true is what works. And so when we think about ethics, we think about how there are perspectives of what is correct or what is morally good based on the goals that we have in mind, right? This kind of instrumental use of ethics. And the same thing could be said here about the epistemological, right, perspective, right? That the pragmatic theory of truth is basically saying that whatever works, that's what is true. And this, in some ways, trying to take us away from the norms. It's trying to take us away from this correspondence thing. However, right, let's use an example. Let's put some English here. For an example, murder is wrong because that's what works for peace. That's a pragmatic statement. That's why it's true. It's true epistemologically, this moral truth, because it works for this goal. And we also have to accept, right, in a pragmatic theory of truth that could one day change. And this is really popular from American philosophers who look to history to, in some ways, prove, right, that this is the case. Interestingly enough, in doing so, what they're doing is doing a correspondence theory of truth. That the pragmatic theory of truth is true because it corresponds to the way that history has shown truth to be revealed, which is, that really sucks. It's showing already some gaping holes in the theory. So another obvious problem with the pragmatic theory of truth is when we say, oh, well, what works is, let's say morally, right? What's true in the moral sphere, epistemologically speaking, is that which works for the good of all. What do we mean by the good of all? That is something normative. That is something that has to do with norms. And we need stability in that meaning to even create effective beliefs in morality. And so the pragmatic theory of truth, as much as it's trying to draw away from the norms, they are dependent on norms themselves. For one, to be corresponded as true, and two, to even get the effective instrumental use that we want out of our truths. And the last theory of truth that we're going to talk about here is the coherence theory of truth. And the coherence theory of truth is saying that a statement is considered true when it is consistent and fits into the larger system of beliefs that one individual or society might have. So this simply might be said as that what is true is what fits in with the rest of the beliefs of a human, because it fits into the rest of the system of truths that we have. And there's an old saying that is that man is the measure of all things. And this is basically, I think, the historical way in philosophy that we might be able to explain what the coherence theory of truth is really trying to get at here. But here's the problems, right? We cannot cohere beliefs outside of the situational world. I'm going to show you how, like we're talking, when we're saying that we want to believe a belief, we are saying we can't just have beliefs that are exempt or that are abstract from the situational world. And so that's one problem here. Our beliefs, aside from cohering with one another, must also cohere with our desires and practical goals. But these practical goals, as we were saying, are rooted inside of norms. But norms, as we're going to see, is related to the correspondence theory of truth. It's not related to a pragmatic theory or a coherence theory. So how does this really work here, right? It doesn't work in morality. Coherence theory of truth does not work in morality because belief systems on ethics can work. For example, Nazism can work, pragmatically speaking, and it can even fit together as a system coherently. That doesn't mean that it's a good one, right? So it isn't a justified system, epistemologically speaking, just because there's pure coherence inside of the system. So what is the good in all three of these perspectives? And what are they drawing at? And why is it that, I guess, we don't really see how they're connected to one another? The correspondence theory, I think for the Christian, we have to see that what is true is firstly what is true in God's mind. So let's apply this to ethics. What is right and wrong, that truth, that moral truth, is what is good and bad in God's mind. That's the epistemic justification for that truth that we might hold. That murder is wrong, that abortion is wrong, that homosexuality is a sin. These are based not just coherently because they fit into the rest of our belief system. They aren't pragmatic because it just works. The more primordial thing is that what is true first must be what is true in God's mind, because He is the one who knows all things. He is the primary knower, and he is the ultimate justification and foundation for that truth. So our ideas are true only if they correspond to the mind of God. That's the normative perspective. So the correspondence theory is outside of the Christian view, and the secular view is an elevation of the normative perspective. The second, the pragmatic theory, shows us the situational perspective, because truth makes results inside of the world, and it's what works. And this is not in itself completely wrong. It's only wrong when we take it out of the ground and the foundation of what's in God's mind. And so for the Christian, the pragmatic theory of truth, what works is truth only works if what we're saying is pragmatic, works for God and in His will. So the situational is grounded in the norms, and what works is not just what we define as what works, right? That norm is defined by what works for God and in His will. And the final theory of truth, the existential perspective, is embodied in that coherence theory of truth. Because what coheres, or what's true, isn't just what coheres for us in our autonomous human reasoning or in our thought. It's not just in our bodies of knowledge and our systems and our principles, if we're talking about ethics, right? What coheres, or what we know, what we should accept to believe as true, is what coheres in the mind of God. So our beliefs must cohere with the system, all the beliefs that are in God's mind. So that's how the coherence, the correspondence, and pragmatic theory all in some ways need one another, and that's how we can kind of redeem it. Like I said, here we see that the elevated positions of the perspectives and taking out God from the center of them leaves us with an unreliability in our thinking and our knowledge of the world, truth of the world, and our ethics. So epistemologically, we need all of these perspectives to be united together. So as a Christian, what we have to do then, we have to know that in the history of philosophy, different epistemological systems are flawed and need a redeeming through the lens of the Bible, starting with the Trinitarian nature of God. When we start there, we're able to see how these are all perspectives that make up the unified truth that we're looking for in all our epistemological systems. So in our next episode, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the justification of knowledge in understanding the location and the structure of justification so that we might have true knowledge. I'm really, really glad that if you're here, you've been listening, and you guys are liking what you guys are hearing and what you guys are learning. If you're a young student, my desire is that you could like and share if you're watching on YouTube. If you're on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, go share it with somebody, and hit the follow so that you guys could always be notified when we release an episode every single Monday. Like I said, I hope to see you guys in that next episode. I'm super excited and blessed to be talking to you guys about epistemology. Come back for the second part. I'll see you guys then. God bless.